Hey, it's Chuck Armstrong with Loudwire Nights, and this is Loudwire Nights On Demand. It is such a privilege to get to say this, man. We had Billy Corgan on the show talking all things new Smashing Pumpkins, diving deep into their latest album, Aghori Mhori Mei. This conversation aired on Wednesday, August 7th. Enjoy this one. Well, a little over a year ago, we welcomed tonight's special guest to the show to dive into his band's triple LP, Autumn. Over the course of several months, they released 3 individual albums that all came together for a massive collection, which they called a rock opera in 3 acts that spanned 33 songs. Now he's back with us celebrating another new album, Aghori Mhori Mei, the latest release from the Smashing Pumpkins. Billy Corgan, thank you so much for being here, man.
Oh, thank you. I can't believe it's another record, but it feels good that we're back rocking and people seem to like the record. It's less challenging, maybe, this record than the last one.
Well, listen, man. I mean, you go from 33 tracks over 3 different albums, and a concept that's connected to 2 other records that you've done to maybe a little simpler of an album. 10 tracks, definitely something reminiscent of the early days of the Pumpkins of the 90s.
Yeah.
And, not that it's easier, but it's definitely a fun record to listen to, man.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's interesting to me, and I know you're hearing this, and I'm curious if you're thinking about this, but the first album of Autumn came out in November 2022. The final one came out in May of 23. The fact alone that you did a triple LP over the course of 6 months is in itself pretty significant. Even more so now is the fact that a year after that, you've given fans another new album. Is that something you think about, like, as the guy behind all this? Or is this something more that fans and critics kind of wrap their heads around?
I don't know, because when you're in the studio, and I'm in the studio a lot, I'm not sure. Frank Zappa used to call it studio tan. You don't see the sun very much, although that's not a bad thing as a goth. But time is elastic in there. We thought the record was going to be done 6 months earlier than it ended up being finished. We did some sessions in Nashville at Blackbird, and I went back to Chicago to kind of finish it up, and of course, once I got in the record, then all these complications started, and I started second guessing the direction. And so for me, it felt like it was a long time, but it probably wasn't. But at the time when I was doing it, it just felt endless.
As you were second guessing, did you end up changing direction, or did you end up feeling confident in the direction you were headed?
I think it was the thing of trying to go back to the band's original ethos and see if there was anything there. It just felt natural to do it at this time. I don't know why, it just did, because obviously we've never done it. So obviously, 30 years, 28 years later, it's not something we do every 7 years, So where am I going with this? On paper, you're like, okay, we're going to kind of pick this feeling back up and see where it goes and see if it yields any fruit. Well, I started having flashbacks to what I didn't like about those records when I made those records, the limitations of that approach, which is in many ways why we pivoted off of that approach in the mid 90s. So you're sort of smack dab in the middle of like, okay, this is the good part of that version of the Pumpkins, and here's the bad part, and that hasn't changed, and it's 30 years later, and I don't have a solution. And there were some other influences that seemed over time to winnow away, and I had to almost bring in other influences. For example, in the beginning, I thought the record would be much more sort of Gish, Siamese melancholy, but as the record went along, it started to take on elements of the band's last record of the 90s, which was Machina. And that felt almost like that voice needed to come forward too somehow. And I never thought that was going to be part of it. It's a little too inside baseball, but in my mind, that wasn't part of my original thinking. So once I dealt with that, it was like, okay, now I'm in this whole other world. Are we dealing with that style of production, that style of darkness? Do I want to even bring that back? Is that a good thing? Sorry, I'm letting you in my head, which is not a good place to be.
I know. I love it. Thank you for that. Are you generally a reflective guy? Like, do you generally enjoy looking back and thinking
No,
about...
not at all. No, I love history, and I love, my house is packed with old stuff. I love old stuff. I love exploring the history of bands. My favorite bands, whether it's Cheap Trick or Led Zeppelin, it's all good. When it comes to me, I don't want to look back at all. I am a bridge burner for sure. And I both publicly and privately. I mean, I'm just like I'm probably more like Bob Dylan in that way, where it's like you do your thing and then you move on to the next one. And everyone's like, why don't you want to do that? And it's like, because that bridge is burned. That time is gone. So even to use the same or metaphor here, to rebuild the bridge back to another time, try to pick up that ethos, think those ways when we were a lot poorer of spirit and and of pocket, and try to pick up those feelings and see whether or not we still had that machine in us. I always knew we did, but until you prove it and you see it on the faces of people that would come in the studio and listen and go, when did you guys step out of a time machine? This is so weird. Like, how were you even able to do this? Was fun. It became kind of an interesting challenge.
Sure. Yeah. No, I love hearing that. Well, I got to say, I mean, having spent some time with it, Billy, as a longtime Pumpkins fan, but also just as a fan of rock and roll, as a fan of music in general, this album made me really happy. Like, as I was listening to it, I was just happy. I got goosebumps at times, and that doesn't happen, listening to new music all the time. I think Aghori Mhori Mei may very well be the album of the year. Forget about genres, lists, formats, anything like that. I think you've created something really special here.
Wow, thank you. That's very humbling to hear. Yeah, we don't really know what we have. We've always traditionally run a very small world. We don't have a lot of groupies, hangers on. We just don't. Even going back to before the band was successful, 97% of all Pumpkins practices were just the four of us.
Yeah.
And that's why there's almost no witness to that history, because there was nobody other than the producers. So we really don't know what we have. Like when Machina came out in 2000, I mean, the reaction was so negative. And we worked on that album for 8 months, and we thought it was pretty cool. We thought we were really onto something. And we were almost like shocked, like, oh my God, people hate this. Like, they hate the record. They don't just dislike it. They hate the record. And then somewhere along the way, you're standing with Gerard Way and Mikey Way, from My Chem.
Yeah.
And they're telling you, that's the record for us. And you're like, okay, that's such, thank you. Like, you're like, you live long enough to have these crazy experiences. So I'm not saying you're gun shy, but you're like, you really hold your breath because you don't really know if what you think is how people are going to feel at that time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear you say, like, you maybe didn't know what you had, and then people would come in the studio, they'd hear it, they'd smile, they'd say, like, did you step out of a time machine? But you also mentioned different influences, and maybe some of those influences waned over the years. What was influencing some of the sounds on this record? Because, it's hard at some points to separate your love of Sabbath with some of the riffs on this album, or even like Sicarus. Man, the first time I heard that, I made this nasty face. It just like, like that rhythm. I don't know if it's like a Dio something, but something inside me
right?
just
it's like,
wanted to get out,
man.
It's
like a Dio riff. Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, I was listening to Dio today. I love Dio so much.
Yeah, well, yeah, he is one of the all-time greats for sure.
Yeah, and what a great guy too. In the beginning, we did this thing where we work with a local Nashville bassist. So it was just Jimmy and I and this bassist, and I was just writing riffs. No vocals, just writing riffs. And we did a bunch of stuff, there'd be a Siamese Dream riff here and a Melancholy riff here and a Gish riff there. It was kind of interesting. We were just kind of playing with the idea. And then all of a sudden I started talking about Motley Crue in the 80s, specifically Too Fast for Love and Shout of the Devil album. And I started talking about, and I hope this isn't too long an answer, and I've talked to Nikki Sixx about this, like Motley Crue in their own crazy minds, they thought they were doing glam. Nikki thought they were doing sweet and, early Bowie or glam Bowie and stuff. But they couldn't really do it, and they hadn't really studied the records. So they did the Motley Crue version of Sweet or something. So you end up with this beautiful, like almost more primitive, but more visceral version of the thing they're trying to kind of be. So I made this connection in my mind, like, well, that's kind of what we were doing. Like, we couldn't be Led Zeppelin, but we could kind of do Pumpkin's fake version of Led Zeppelin or Pumpkin's fake version of Soundgarden or something, right? So you have to get back in this mindset because we're so much more skilled 25, 30 years later than we were, that you have to find the primitive space of the riff. So when you identify the Dio part of the record or the Sabbath part of the record, that's exactly it. You've got to kind of find the thing that made you want to rock in the first place.
Yeah. Not
the 30-year later version of what makes you rock. Like what kind of riff would get out of the garage? Not what kind of riff would get out of the expensive, SIR rehearsal space in the 21st century. What kind of riff would you be willing to risk your life on, get in a van and drive all over America for? When the guy's standing there throwing a beer bottle at your head, you believe that riff is better than the guy throwing the bottle at your head, that you're willing to die and get hit in the head with the beer bottle for the riff. You got to get back into that space. So you got to be willing to live or die for those riffs. That's the way we thought back then. And I'm not saying you get old and fat and lazy, but you don't have that same willingness to sort of stand on the stage and take the sling and arrow of the thing. So to stick your foot in it and say, okay, I really believe in this riff, like you said, sick riff, like me and Jimmy, we love that riff. That riff comes on, and every time you're just like, yes, that's so good.
Yeah. And the bridge on 999, that was another one where I was just like knocked back. And again, like I remember, I'm like, why am I making this nasty face? It's just like so good, man.
Yeah. Well, all credit, James is such a cool cat. He has such an interesting take on music. Jimmy's obviously one of the greatest drummers ever. And we're blessed that, we can think of this crazy stuff,
Yeah.
And Jimmy's so great because he really is egoless. So if we're working on a song and he's playing like Jimmy Chamberlain, right? And of course it sounds good. And I go, hey, can you play this part a little bit more like Bill Ward from, 74 Bill Ward, not 70 Bill Ward, not 78 Bill Ward. I want 74 Bill Ward. And Jimmy goes, sure, whatever you need. That's the amazing thing about Jimmy. He's willing to do any crazy thing I can think of.
Yeah.
So, and I think you're kind of poking at the fun is in the record. Like there's a lot of fun in this record. You don't normally associate this with a good time, but it's about the closest we come to a good time.
For sure, man. Yeah, there's definitely, moments where, I'm just, like whether I'm making a nasty breakdown face or air guitar and whatever it is, like it is all over. And there's also deeper moments too, and not just the riffs, not just the music, but maybe I'm just reading into this a bit. And, more and more will come out as I listen to the album through again and again. But is there an overarching biblical or spiritual or divine theme to this album? It seems like whether it's, like the track title, Go With the Fall, which I loved. I love that song, man. That took me back to the 90s. Or Pentecost, or you saying Babylon, Babylon in War Dreams. Is there something deeper here that I'm hearing, or am I trying to read something into this?
No, I think it's this. For those of us that grew up in the 70s and 80s, we were still at the tail end of like, I remember being in like first grade and going in the hall and practicing nuclear Holocaust drills, right? Duck and cover, you know what I mean? Like I did that stuff in the 70s.
Yeah.
I'd be like, you're 6 years old. What are we doing? If a nuclear bomb comes off, we're going to come in the hall and we're going to put your head between your knees. And it was really Reagan with the fall of the Soviet Union that sort of ended that conversation, not to say that there isn't always the threat of nuclear holocaust. Well, if you listen to experts, we are closer to World War III than we have been literally since probably the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961. And yet you go on social media and it's like, look at this crazy cat clip. And right, it does feel at times, and I'm not proselytizing, but it does feel at times that we're in this sort of kind of crazy biblical type of thing.
Yeah.
Where it's the high of, oh my God, Taylor Swift in a stadium with 90,000 people, or Green Day just played in Italy, 80,000 people. These amazing global events of people coming together and singing and waving their phone and all this stuff. And then, oh, by the way, there might be a nuclear war breaking out tomorrow. It's like,
right, yeah.
You got to find something that gives you some code or key by which to sort of process the information. It's not biblical as much for me as just saying, what did they know 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, whether it's Mark Twain or, Socrates, that tells us that the human condition to both try to live, party, go crazy, and at the same time blow ourselves up when we don't have to. When so many people are hurting, post-pandemic, whether it's health-related issues or depression-related issues, teen suicide is through the roof. The unwillingness of the government to really look at the impact of social media on young people, particularly for their self-esteem. I mean, we have such complicated problems. It's like at some point, I'm a parent. I got to figure out what I got to tell my kids. And I'll tell you something private here, but I'm fine to talk about it publicly, is, where I live in Highland Park, Illinois, we had a mass shooter who shot over 50 people in under a minute. I think he shot 80 something rounds into a crowd of 3,000 people on the 4th of July. Okay. My kids are 8 and 5 years old. They don't know that happened. We've kept it from them. We made a decision as a family to not let them know. Well, at some point they're going to find out. What do I tell my kids? Oh, this is normal in America. Like, thank God we weren't there. No, like, what is that? Understand? It's like, I struggle for the words. So to your question, and I'm over explaining, is the album grapples with, how do I explain these things to myself even?
Yeah.
And look, and I'm not saying this to be a snob. I'm a lucky person. I've been very successful. I've been blessed to be supported in a musical life for over 30 years. I could pick up and move. I could take my Ferrari and go home, right? I want to be part of what turns our country around. This country of America is such an amazing place of opportunity. And you see it, whether it was the breakthrough of Obama's presidency or, we've had such incredible things happen and we have so many things to fix, but we are the best country in the world for opportunity. And I don't want to live in another country. I don't want to be living on an island, reading on my phone, watching my town of Chicago and my country fall apart.
Right.
I'm not saying I'm going to fix anything, but as an artist, I'm at least trying to explain what I'm going through. And I've been lucky enough that people seem to want to hear what I have to say in artistic terms. They definitely don't want my opinion, but at least they're willing to listen to my take on it artistically.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, man. And I do think that comes through. And it's not, everything you just said is, a listener could think, man, it's hopeless, like what a dark, depressing thing, but the album's not hopeless. I mean, you already said, there's fun to it, and you certainly hear that in the music. But even like on a song like Pentagrams, you say, more than once, love never dies, and so there are moments like that too that cut through the noise and cut through the darkness and whatever that is.
Let me answer you on that, because I think this is really at the heart of what you're asking. When you get up on stage and people come to a concert venue, they spend their good money, they get a babysitter, whatever, they're there. They buy the t-shirt. When you put on a great show, it is the most life-affirming thing, right? It's the way to cut through the darkness. We're here, we're together, we want to live, we want to rock, we want to have a good time, we want to love each other, we don't want to live in this crazy world. And many of us are super powerless against much larger forces. But when we get together, I don't care where you're from, I don't care who you love, I don't care where you grew up, I don't care what your political party is. When we get together and we sing with a common voice, whether it's my songs or Eddie Vedder's songs or Jerry Cantrell's songs or Billie Eilish's songs, it's so powerful. That's the way you fight this. You live, you be in this moment. And the madness of it all, I'm not saying it doesn't affect you, but it affects you just a little bit less because your priorities are straight, And Sean Parker, who I've known since he was 19 years old, one of the founders of Facebook, he said in an interview, we knew when we set up the Facebook algorithms or whatever, that we were going to dick people into a system that was going to send them down a lane where they were only going to believe what they believed and kept them from the other opinion. And we knew it was a bad thing, but we couldn't resist because it was a good business model for getting clicked.
Yeah.
So here we are 20 years later into the post-social media world, and we're just trying to figure out. And I think, and this is the end of this story, I think that's why so many people are coming to see Green Day and Pumpkins and Coldplay and Billie Eilish. They want to fight that with the one thing they can do, which is have a good time and live in this moment and celebrate life. Love, cry, get angry, but get angry about the right stuff.
That's right, man. Yeah. And that's true. And I say that a lot on this show, man, where there's two elements of connecting with music, and that's one, like me sitting in my room with my headphones on, which is how I first listened to Aghori Mhori Mei, like just rocking out by myself. But also, man, I can't wait to see you and stand with thousands of other people, many of whom are complete strangers, and yet all of us connecting on the same thing, on the same level.
Yeah. Very blessed to have stood on so many stages and had that experience of having my words sung back to me. I mean, you want to talk about humbling. Yeah. It's wild.
Well, man, Billy, thank you for all this, man. I know we got to wrap up, and I know we're just scratching the surface too, but
got to go to sound check, man. I got the band is waiting.
I know. I got to say too, though, I cannot wait for the physical product of this. I know the intention behind this album is to hear it in full, and I can't wait. I can't wait for that. I know your tea shop in Highland Park, Madame Zuzu's, is going to have a really cool vinyl edition of the album with a couple of extra tracks on a 7-inch. And so that gets me excited to hear even more music out of these sessions. But I just got to say, congrats on this Aghori Mhori Mei. It is out everywhere digitally right now, coming in physical form soon enough. You're on the road with Green Day. You're doing some headlining shows with Pumpkins. Thank you for the time, man. You are welcome back anytime. And love hearing everything you got to say, man. Yeah.
Love talking to you today. Thanks so much. Blessings to everyone. Thank you.
That wraps up this episode of Loudwire Nights on Demand. Stay caught up with everything happening in the world of rock and metal on the Loudwire app and at loudwire.com.